evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Catholic Theological Union. I am Ferdinand Okorie, the Vice President and Academic Dean here at Catholic Theological Union, and it's a warm welcome to everyone to this virtual gathering of the first part of two-part series on the conversation on the history of the rise of Islam and Christianity in the African American communities, an event that is sponsored through a Catholic Muslim study program and Dr. White. Friends, it is events such as this that speaks of our institution's core mission in our church and also in the world, namely to bring together peoples of diverse faith traditions to discuss our unity and distinctive, unique, and complementary faith traditions. For those who may not know this, Catholic Theological Union founding vision is foregrounded by the mission to promote in the spirit of Roman Catholic Vatican II Council document, Nostra Aetate, the common ground of faith discussion, respect and mutual appreciation among faith traditions. We take very personal the commitment and dedication to the interreligious dialogue and learning that is critical to a harmonious and peaceful coexistence and mutual respect among peoples of diverse faith. It pleases me to inform those who are new to our institution's vision in theological education that our Catholic Muslim study program is founded to promote in theological education, academic learning, and activities in interreligious consciousness among Roman Catholic ministers who graduate from our institution. Through the Catholic Muslim program directed by Professor Rezwan, our students who are preparing for ministry ground their training in the consciousness of the Islamic faith and interreligious collaboration that our world dearly seeks for peaceful existence. It pleases me to inform you that 40% of our students are seminarians training for the Roman Catholic priesthood, while 20% of our students are nuns in religious communities. And finally, 40% of our students are lay persons training for various ministries in our church and in the world. Most of these students are also in our Black African American Catholic study program, named after the first recognized African American Catholic priest in the US, Father Augustus Totten. The Totten Scholarship is a fully funded program that equips the next generation of ministers in our world, serving in varieties of pastoral ministries, care, teaching in high school, and preparing for further graduate theological education. I invite anyone who is interested and or who knows someone who could benefit from a solid theological education and a professional career in various religious and pastorally based ministries to inquire about scholarship opportunities through our Totten Scholarship. Totten scholars benefit from an education grounded in theological learning on issues that this gathering, this virtual gathering this evening, will discuss, and turn such education into active engagement in the church and also in the world. Therefore, I turn it over to Professor Rezwan to get us started on this evening conversation as we listen to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Ferdinand, for your remarks and for your support. I begin in the name of God, the more compassionate, the more merciful. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good evening and greetings of God's peace, blessings, and compassion be upon all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Saeed Atif Rizwan, and I am assistant professor of Islamic Studies and Interreligious Studies, as well as director of the Catholic Muslim Studies program here at Catholic Theological Union. Before getting into everything, I just wanted to first thank the marketing team for the wonderful job they did in getting the name and the information out about this evening's program. I'd also like to thank the Associate Director of the Bernardine Center, Peter Cunningham, for his wonderful work and support this evening. And I would also like to thank the Waraich family, whose support has helped us to put this evening's program together. The Catholic Muslim Studies program is interconnected with the Bernardine Center, which was founded approximately 26 years ago to continue Cardinal Bernardine's ministry of reconciliation and peacemaking, interreligious dialogue, leadership development for the Catholic Church, and the consistent ethic of life, and as well for the search for the common good in the world. The Catholic Muslim Studies program itself was founded in the year 2000 with the intention of promoting mutual understanding, reconciliation, and cooperation between Muslims and Christians in order to advance justice and compassion in the human family. Through the Catholic Muslim Studies program, we offer public programming such as this evening's to bring together people of various traditions, be they religious or otherwise, in the hope of learning from one another to not only transform ourselves, but the world in which we live and the world we hope it to be one day. Through the Catholic Muslim Studies program, we offer courses on Islam, as well as in relation to Christianity, such as comparative Christian-Muslim ethics and the history of Muslim-Christian relations. We also provide full tuition scholarships for Muslim students who enroll in degree programs at CTU. Before explaining the structure of tonight's program, I would like to turn it over to my co-host, colleague, and friend, Dr. Vanessa White. Vanessa?
Thank you. Thank you, Saeed. I am Dr. C. Vanessa White, the Associate Professor of Spirituality and Ministry and the Director of the Certificate in Black Theology and Ministry. The Certificate in Black Theology and Ministry is an 18 graduate credit hour certificate that is designed to offer students a background in theology, spirituality, pastoral ministry, intercultural studies, and related disciplines within a Black African American context. Upcoming courses this academic year include Race, Caste in the Catholic Church in the spring semester, and the Spiritual Writings of Thea Bowman and Howard Thurman. For more information, please contact me at vwhite@ctu.edu. I now would like to take a moment to introduce our panelists for tonight's program. Dr. Elena Morgan is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at the University of Southern California. Trained as a historian of the African diaspora, Professor Morgan's research focuses on the historic utility of religion, in particular Islam, in racial liberation and anti-colonial movements of the mid to late 20th century Atlantic world. As part of a body of work of intellectual, political, and religious history, Professor Morgan's research teases out the connection between religious identity and racial formation, intellectual discourse, and grassroots activism in local and global politics. Her first book, entitled Atlantic Crescent, Dreaming of Black Muslim Liberation, considers the ways that Islam and Blackness were used by Muslims and non-Muslims in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Anglophone Caribbean to form the basis of transnational and anti-colonial and anti-imperial political movements from the end of World War II to the end of the 20th century. This book investigates the varying ways that Muslims of African descent thought of colonialism and imperialism, focusing at various times on European colonization, American neo-imperialism in Latin America, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, and on the idea of the urban inner city as a colonized and occupied space. At USC, Professor Morgan teaches classes on African American and African diaspora history, Islam in the Americas, race and ethnicity in America, mass incarceration, discipline and racialized punishment, Black intellectual history, and Black international movements. Dr. Cecilia Moore was born and raised in Danville, Virginia. She is a graduate of Sweetbriar College and the University of Virginia. Dr. Moore is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton, where she teaches the introduction of religions and theological studies, U.S. Catholic experience, and African American religious history. In the summers, she is part of the faculty of the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University of Louisiana. Dr. Moore's area of specialization is the history of African American Catholics, and nearly all of her published works are in this field. A few of her more recent publications are From the Ivory Tower to the Pews, Theology's Role in Shaping Catholic Racial Thought and Practice in the 20th Century. Dealing with Desegregation, Black and White Responses to the Desegregation of the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina, 1953. To Serve Through Compelling Love, The Society of Christ Our King in Danville, Virginia, 1963. In addition to publishing articles in numerous scholarly journals, popular magazines, and chapters in books, Dr. Moore also co-edited Songs of Our Hearts and Meditations of Our Souls, Prayers for Black Catholics, with the late Father Paul Marshall and myself. She has been a member of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and the American Catholic Historical Association. And now I'd like to turn it over to Saeed, who will explain the framing of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So the program structure is as follows. We have 4 discussion topics with responses and conversations between our panelists. And for each discussion topic, we will allow a conversation to go on for about 10 minutes. After we've engaged the 4 discussion topics, we will field questions from the audience for about 15 minutes maximum. Audience members can submit their questions anytime during the program, but please do note that whether you submit a question during the program or during the Q&A, audience members' comments and questions can only be seen by myself and by Dr. White. We strongly encourage and hope that you, the audience, will submit questions to us, and so that we can enrich the conversation that we're about to embark on. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to discussion topic number 1. Why did the early African communities convert to Christianity and Islam? Historically, why did African Americans continue to convert to Christianity and Islam? And I invite Dr. Morgan to begin the comments for this question. Dr. Morgan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Saeed. So for Islam, well, we have to start really kind of with the antebellum period. I'll get to the issue of conversion in a moment, right? But many people who were enslaved, who were brought to the Americas, were Muslims. Islam had penetrated through the African continent during the medieval period. And so a lot of West Africans practiced Islam, lived in Muslim polities, right, at different times. And once in the Americas, they actually were forced to convert, or at least to visibly suppress their Muslim religious beliefs, right? They still did practice these things in secret, oftentimes, but after a certain point, right, people from the African continent stopped coming directly, right? And those religious traditions became disconnected from the African continent. And so we have, right, a several hundred years period where that connection, that direct connection to Islam and Islamic practice is becoming less and less secure. There are some isolated communities, particularly in the Georgia Sea Islands and South Carolina Sea Islands, where there are noticeable retentions. But for the most part, right, the history of Islam in African American communities begins with a rupture, right, from that earlier period. So by the 20th century, really very few African Americans were practicing Islam in any fashion that could be recognized as such. And in the early 20th century, around the time of the First World War, African Americans begin to migrate to the urban North and the Midwest in search of a better life. They look at the North as this land of opportunity where there's not going to be as much racism, where there will be jobs, where there'll be better housing, and they don't really find that. And it's in religion that they begin to kind of find succor from this dissociative reality. In particular, Islam becomes one of them, right? And there are both Orthodox and non-Orthodox formulations. Probably the first it's referred to as a pseudo-Islamic, but I don't know that I really love that term, pseudo-Islamic. But it's the first tradition that really has Islamic references, the Moorish Science Temple of America, which uses Islamic reference. Their holy book is called the Seven Circle Quran, which is not really a Quran in any recognizable way. But during this period, right, Islam begins to appear as a solution to some of the racial dystopia, right? That makes up the urban North and the Midwest. And people start to convert to Islam, not just through, right, the Moorish Science Temple, but the Nation of Islam becomes extremely popular, right? It starts in the 1930s, but becomes extremely popular by mid-century. And we also have, right, Orthodox formulations of Islam as well, right, that people have the opportunity to choose from. And I think that some of the reasons that people look to Islam is that they see Christianity as being complicit in the racism that they've suffered. So I'll leave it at that for now. And looking forward to hearing what Dr. Moore has to say as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much. Slavery really is the major factor in the conversion of Africans in the Americas in the earliest period. In the case of Catholics, the Catholic powers in the Americas were the Spanish and the French, and both of them required that that everyone who lived in their colony, they wanted everyone who lived in their colony to be Catholic. The Code Noir, which was used in Louisiana, had a legal requirement for all slaves to be baptized and instructed in the Catholic faith. And we have documentation from sacramental records of places like St. Augustine, Florida, and New Orleans, in the ways that enslaved Blacks were part of and integral to the Catholic colonial church. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm hearing a feedback. But okay, so that happens, and but we have ways of becoming free too in Catholic colonies, and the Spanish offer a way for enslaved Blacks to become free if they will come, and this has in the 17th century, if they come to Florida, convert to Catholicism, and agree to fight to defend the Spanish colony. So we've got Blacks who choose to become Catholic in order to become free in the 17th century. It's a more complicated picture with the Protestant Christians. A lot of the Protestants, slaveholders were not comfortable at all with the idea of Christian slaves. They thought it might cut into profits. Some of them just couldn't fathom that Blacks could be civilized or intelligent enough to become Christian. They were very uncomfortable with the egalitarian implications of Christianity if they took the scriptures seriously. So they weren't happy about the idea. Missionaries, however, have a job to do, and they convinced some slaveholders in the British colonies to allow them to start coming and converting on plantations. They promised they could make Christian slaves who would be more obedient and that would serve their masters out of love and a sense of duty, and that they would teach them that they needed to focus on their salvation, which was in heaven. So we'll see some conversion before the American Revolution of Africans in America to Christianity, Protestant forms of Christianity. But it's really going to get going in the 19th century with the Second Great Awakening and revivals. We'll see many more convert at that time. We will also see the enslaved community create their own, what Albert Rabateau called the invisible institution, where they practice Christianity on their own, away from the eyes of their masters. And we'll also see about the same time, independent Black churches come online. So I think I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Morgan, did you have anything to share in response to what Dr. Moore has said, and Dr. Moore, vice versa, anything that Dr. Morgan raised that you found interesting?
I think that the last point that Dr. Moore made, I think is extremely important, right? This idea that people are really kind of practicing religion. They're practicing the religions that they want to practice outside of the gaze of slave masters, right? Outside of the gaze of institutions. And I think that for that reason, it's the issue of this issue of the question of when the conversions happen, right? Like, I think is very difficult, as is the question of, well, did conversions happen? Period, right? Because we have a lot of, right, there's a lot of people that continue to practice indigenous religious traditions, right? They practice Islam. Some slave masters are more amenable, right, to enslaved people practicing religious traditions. right, that they want to practice by the like the early, right, 19th century. At least the British are actively trying to kind of get people from Muslim areas. They consider these people to be smarter, to be more attractive, to be right, more hardworking, right? Like they, you know, so it's kind of like I don't know that you know, I think that it's a difficult, like the question of conversion is really a difficult question. I mean, at some point, right, people do really have a disconnection, right, with Islam. And I think that the overarching environment of Christianity, in particular, the fact that Christianity right, like the slave trade is justified by Christianity. Everybody needs to be Christian. Otherwise, how can you justify, right, that this religion is supposed to make people better, right? That this is justifying, right, like this brutal, right, institution. But I think that as is always the case, right, like with people, right, is that they kind of do what they want to do, right, and they practice the things that they want to practice, and they hold on to the traditions as much as they can that they want to and need to hold on to. And I think that goes to, right, a really long history of resistance and religion, right, in African American communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that additional reflection. I think it's a really important point about what to say about conversion and what that could really look like, and you know, if there's really a way to pinpoint that. So appreciate that nuance. I'll turn it up to Vanessa for discussion topic number 2.
And yes, that was the promise made by the Freedmen's Bureau, formerly enslaved people that were...
I'm sorry, Vanessa, you're muted.
We ask that you please mute yourself because we are hearing some background noise when the speakers are talking. Thank you. So our discussion topic number 2, what functions did religion play in the lives of Christian and Muslim African American communities, particularly looking at familial, political, and liberatory? And we begin this question and this discussion topic with Dr. Moore. Cecilia.
Okay, thank you very much. I start this question in the antebellum period. And what I see there in the antebellum experience is African-American Christians, both free and enslaved, experiencing their faith and their houses and places of worship as portals to freedom, spiritual freedom, which gave them the ability to decide for themselves who God was to them, to understand who they were to God and who they were to one another. We see this in the development of Black theologies and spiritualities in the antebellum period. We also see this in the music that they create, the spirituals tradition. They pray for and with each other in their churches, because as I've already said, we have independent Black churches established at this time. They preach in those churches. In the Hush Harbor, they preach and pray, and they also dance. It was where they gathered as family and friends, both blood family and fictive kin. We have this idea of the church family that I think we can see it emerging in this period of time, and that is something that continues to this day. It was a safe space, that this gave them a safe space to share sorrow and joy. And it's also where plots to attain freedom were hatched and executed. In the case of Black Catholics in this period, we see them create religious organizations and institutions too. We have 2 orders of Black sisters created at this time who become teachers, catechists, and also provide health care in the Black community. And we also will see them start to create parishes. I have the big 3, St. Augustine's, New Orleans, St. Augustine's, Isle Breville, and St. Augustine's, Washington, D.C., all examples. Leadership is, I think, a main thing that comes out of this religious leadership, political leadership, leadership for liberation. Men and women are involved in this. It continues after the Civil War as we move into that long civil rights movement that gets going after Reconstruction, at the period of racial uplift and the formal civil rights movement. So I think I'll stop there.
Great. Dr. Morgan?
Yes. So I guess I'll start as well in the antebellum period, but I think that the thing that I want to emphasize is that I really see the function of, I mean, religion obviously serves a lot of different functions, right? Community building functions, functions like in terms of hope, right? In terms of kind of finding personal strength and all of these things. But I think that the history of Islam in the Americas really is associated with the ideas of liberation, ideas of freedom, right? And from the 16th century, we really see governments such as, right, like the governor of Hispaniola in the 16th century basically wrote a letter to the Spanish crown being like, please do not send any more Muslim slaves here because they will not stop engaging in insurrection, right? In the 19th century, we see the Bahian Revolt, which was led by Muslim religious leaders from West Africa, and which took place, right, during Ramadan, right, and was associated with, and, you know, when they raided the headquarters, they found all kinds of imaginings, right, of Mecca. They found Islamic religious texts. They found talismans, etc. And so, into, right, the 20th century, we see the ways that, in my own research, right, I see the connection of Islam with anti-colonialism and with anti-colonial movements for African Americans living in the city, but also the ways that they use that to dream of liberation for themselves and for people like them, right? And so I think that we're going back to this idea of community building, right? That Islam in that sense also has been used to build with other marginalized populations throughout the world, and to imagine a way that people of color are not, right, like an oppressed minority, but instead really kind of like this powerful super majority. One of the things that my subjects often say, right, I have some subjects, right, that I work on who are Bermudian, who used to be Nation of Islam, and now they've kind of transitioned, they say, to Sunni Islam. And in the early 2000s, they participated in this movement for Bermudian for them to not be a colony anymore, right? And one of the things that they say is that they're motivated to do this because of their religion, because Islam necessitates that they be free. And I think that this is something that you hear repeatedly, right? So I think that it has a huge role in undergirding these liberatory traditions, these freedom traditions, these ideas about right, about Black power, really. And I think that it also, right, in the 20th century has done a lot of work to instill a sense of pride for Black people, in particular because they have always been part of this extremely long history that has placed them at the bottom of a regional hierarchy, that has told them that they are just one step right above animals, that they're not capable of thought, that they're not capable of success, right? And in particular, the Nation of Islam told Black people, no, you know, you are capable of success. You're capable of having your own businesses, your own schools, your own, you're able of taking care of yourself in your own communities, right? And so I think that that self-esteem was a huge thing for Black people, and that they really felt that, right, like that Islam played a massive role in kind of reorienting the way that Black people thought about themselves. So I'll leave it at
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elena. Cecilia, as you were listening to Elena, one of the things that I was struck is when she was speaking about this sense that the religion was the motivation toward being free. As you were doing your research, did you see some similarities with Christianity in that respect and African Americans?
Yes, there are African. One person who I think had a sensibility that is very similar to the experience, to the sensibility of Black Muslims in America in that antebellum period is Henry Highland Garnet, who, you know, he says, he says, you know, if you're a Christian, you have to be free, because that's God created you to be free. And so you have to fight for your freedom. You have to be willing to fight for your freedom. Now, his was a voice that, in what we know about him today, so somebody was paying attention to him, but he was out of the mainstream with the forcefulness which he spoke about that. But I do think that that what Elena has said about I wrote it down. Religion is a necessity. The religion, Islam, necessitates that they be free. So there's not a choice. You have to do this. And I loved your story about how they're saying, do not send anybody down here who is Muslim, because we do not want insurrections. We do all of the like big slave uprisings or rebellions, those that actually like moved, like, so there was a rebellion that was able to actually happen, or the ones that were thwarted before they could happen. Those also were all led by Christians. So we have that too. It's not, but it is similar.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Saeed for our discussion topic number 3.
Thank you, Vanessa. So in what ways, if any, were Christian and Muslim African-American converts respectively welcomed into larger Christian and Muslim communities? And so, you know, leave the time frame, the time period open, but, you know, we just want to try to understand what was happening within the intra-communal dynamics as you have slaves converting, or that who came as Christians or as Muslims, and then also subsequent generations who are converting, and what did it look like for them to be connected or not connected to the larger communities that already existed there. And for this, I'll ask Dr. Morgan to speak first, please.
Okay, yeah. So, so in what ways were Muslim African Americans welcomed into the larger Muslim community, they were not really, and I would venture to say that they still are not really, which is unfortunate because Islam has this idea of the Ummah, right? Like the international, transnational Muslim community that's supposed to kind of transcend every nation, every race, right? But in reality, this is not really the way that things work. I mean, my students, my African-American students who are Muslim report, and I think that these are widely held feelings, right? Report feelings of marginalization, being looked at as inauthentic, right? Being excluded, even where, right, they practice Sunni Islam. African Americans are not seen to, right, hold their own religious authority. I think that they look at, they report this overall atmosphere of Middle Eastern or sometimes South Asian Muslim supremacy, right? That because Islam comes from those areas, right, that those representations of Islam are more seen as more authentic. Now, this is true, right? Like, so I think that there have been, right, like attempts to bridge these particular gaps, right? Even in heterodox movements, right? Like the Nation of Islam, historically they reached out to Orthodox Muslims, had relationships with Orthodox Muslims, sought the Council of Orthodox Muslims, right, to try to kind of draw them more visibly into the Ummah. For instance, right, like recently surrounding the issue of Black Lives Matter, a collective of Muslims all across the United States, Muslim organizations signed a petition, right, basically a statement of solidarity with Black Muslims who have experienced police brutality and police violence, right? And this petition basically argues, like, listen, like, Black Muslim issues are Muslim issues, period, right? And that we should have the backs of our, right, co-religionists, right, who just happen to be Black. And so I think that there are moves that are being made to kind of break down these barriers. And there are some mosques, for instance, right, that are a little more multicultural. I think it was in 2012, the New York Times published an article about a mosque on Long Island. And this was a big deal, right, in 2012, because this was a mosque where South Asian and African American people would pray together, which is really not something that often happens, right? That it was necessary even to write this article, right? Like, is indicative of the fact that this isn't something that typically happens. People really tend to stay in their own kind of ethnic enclaves. And so I would say that it's a constant struggle, right, for African American Muslims to be accepted into the larger community. If you are Sunni, it's a little easier, but it's by no means guaranteed, right? And I think that this has to do a lot with internalized issues of racism and racial hierarchy. And unfortunately, but you know, there are organizations that are trying to make strides.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Very much agree with your comments on this, and they make a lot of sense. Dr. Moore.
Okay, thanks. I think context is an important question is important for this question. So I try to look at different periods. In that antebellum period, many of the Black Protestant Christians felt so unwelcome that is what moved them in the direction of establishing their own independent denominations of the mainline Protestant traditions, like the Baptist and the Methodist and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. That would lead them to also create their own seminaries and colleges. Then we move into the abolitionist era, and we see Black and white Protestants who are anti-slavery doing some work together, so much so that when the Civil War, even before it's over, we've got Black and white Protestants going to places like South Carolina to start schools there for the newly freed. A great example is the Penn School of Helena Island, South Carolina. So you have some opportunities, some things that bring them together, but for the most part, these institutions remain separate even after the war is over, and we don't see a reunion. The Protestants, white Protestants, split North and South over the issue of the Civil War, and really don't start to get back together again until the 1950s and 60s, and some as late as the 70s. So there isn't a huge embrace of Blacks into those communities, and Blacks have established their own Christian worlds, if you will. And we see that similar situation with Catholicism, but again, context matters. Catholicism doesn't let you go out and create your own independent Catholic churches and still say you're Catholic. You're not going to be considered Catholic if you do that. So in the antebellum period, the churches are all technically integrated because everybody is in them, but they're in segregated areas. In the South, there are some problems in the northern Catholic churches in this same period where Blacks feel excluded. We have an amazing letter from the 19th century Black Catholic laywoman writing about the discrimination she and other Black Catholics are facing in New York City. Then after the war, we have the decision to essentially establish a separate set of Catholic institutions, churches, schools, and other things that are Catholic for Black people. And there are some Blacks in some communities that really fight back against that. That happens in New Orleans with the people who were before Civil War were called the Free People of Color. In New Orleans, they do not hold with being segregated in their churches, but it's really not something they can change. And what we see happen is Blacks in this situation where they're essentially said, you're going to be in your own parishes, they decide to make those places worlds that address their needs and their hopes and their desires. Mm-hmm. So we see that happen. I think I'm probably out of time.
No, you had some time left, but thank you. One thing that Dr. Morgan talks about is that some of the ways in which African-American Muslims were excluded was around questions of authenticity or inauthenticity. Were there similar experiences within the Catholic churches as well, that Black Catholics were being framed as being inauthentic, or that it's not equally as Catholic as white Catholics? I mean, how did the segregation and the separation actually take place in the church itself, in the buildings themselves, and on what basis? I mean, even
the segregation.
Yeah.
Well, in the antebellum period, like I said, everybody's in the same church, but there is segregated seating. So there's a section for white people, a section for the Creole people, the free people of color, And there's a section for the enslaved community, or who are considered the Blacks. So that's what you have. That's what you have in many places at that time. In the North, it wasn't so much that, and you had many fewer Black Catholics in the North in that antebellum period. When they decide to create these parishes, especially for Blacks, as I said, you know, people create their own worlds, and so people get used to this is the way it is, and they make the most of it. And so, you know, there's some really creative things that people do and things that endure to this day. One of the things that's created in this period of time is the Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver, which still exists today. Black Catholics get their own university at this time in the 1920s, with Xavier University being established, and that still is the only Black and Catholic institution in the US. And so things that are created that become by Black people, because they are segregated, they create institutions and worlds and experiences for themselves and their children that help them build their own sense of identity of what it means to be a Black Catholic person. And so then when we've got integration, what happens is, well, let's close down those Black parishes and the Black people should just move in and like be integrated. And then so many did not feel welcome. And what we have is that so many then left. So again, I don't want to take up all the time.
No. Thank you. It's disheartening, but it's shocking, you know, that on the one hand, we have Christianity and Islam as, you know, universal religions, and within the church and within the mosques, we have, you know, revelations that talk about humanity and what it means to be a fully human person in the sight of God. And then, but in actuality, this disparity on the basis of skin color. And it's quite shocking to understand how it functioned on the ground, even within the religious institutions and the buildings themselves. So, you know, thank you both for those insightful comments. I turn it over to Vanessa.
Thank you. We have our final discussion topic and question. Historically, has there been interreligious dialogue between Christian and Muslim African Americans? If so, in what ways? And I will invite Dr. Moore to begin speaking on this one, and then, well, I said Dr. Moore, and I see Dr. Morgan's up. Thank you. So Dr. Moore, Cecilia?
Okay, well, I had a challenge finding some examples of what we would formally call interreligious dialogue, and I don't know that I really came up with any true ones, but maybe Dr. Morgan did. But here's what I have to offer. One thing, the Million Man March, 1995, which was called for by Minister Farrakhan, Nation of Islam. And it was a call for religious leaders of the Black community writ large to participate and to help bring the members of their communities to Washington. I think that I don't know that they so much talked about religious ideas at the Million Man March. I can imagine men having conversations with each other at that time. But it was viewed by many as a religious gathering, an interreligious gathering. I also found some examples of Black Muslims expressing solidarity with Black Christians in 2015, when so many Black churches were burned in the South. I'm certain that young Black Christians and Muslims who are part of Black Lives Matter are in conversation with each other about their religious values and beliefs. There are some things that I think we could dialogue about and should, and one is our histories. I think it is amazing that we know we're starting to learn more about how significant the Black Muslims were in the earliest foundations of America, and how valued they were for the things, the abilities that they brought with them. And so I teach an African American religion class. I've been trying myself to learn more about the history and bring it more into what I teach. I've made some baby steps. I hope every year I will be able to do more. But I think that history is something that we could talk about together, particularly Black Catholics and Black Muslims, because they're the earliest ones here in the Americas who are not practicing the traditional indigenous African religions. So I think that's a point that we could talk about. There are political and cultural and freedom issues that I think matter to all of us, as Black people, period, but as people of faith in particular. So we could have dialogue on things like voting rights, prison abolition, the need to have excellent public schools. Those are things I think that could bring us together. I don't know if Black Muslims are seeing a decline in youth. Black Christians are. I think that's another point of where we could come together and have some dialogue, like what can we do? And then the whole question of immigration. One of the things that keeps the Black Catholic number fairly steady, I would argue, is immigration. A lot of the immigrants from African countries to the US are Catholic. And I think that is true with Islam as well. So how are we welcoming the new African Americans? How are we welcoming them into our churches and our mosques? That I think would be a great thing for us to have dialogue about. So.
Yeah, I mean, I also, right, will admit that I kind of struggled with this particular question to find concrete examples of specifically Black Christians and Black Muslims. I have found instances like where Christians and Muslims, right, have tried to have dialogue, in particular, right, like the Islamic Society of North America has had several institutionalized attempts at having kind of conversations between themselves, right, and Catholics and Baptists in particular. But in terms of Black Christians and Black Muslims, I really, really struggled to find anything really concrete. But I do think that, as Dr. Moore pointed out, there are a lot of different ways that people can have these conversations. I think in particular because as Muslim Advocates, which is this organization that I had mentioned in my last comment, I think it was the last comment or maybe the one before, that put out that statement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, for instance, right? They recognize that Black people whether they are Christian or Muslim, are vulnerable in the same ways, right, in this country. And I think that we can have a lot of dialogue, as Dr. Moore pointed out, about a lot of these things. And I have seen a lot of calls for solidarity, you know, in particular, Black Lives Matter. I saw some calls, some at least Muslim Christian calls for solidarity surrounding the issues that happened with Standing Rock. I know that Nation of Islam was there, along with some Christian organizations. They were on the ground protesting. And so I think that it is happening. And I would love for somebody to do more research on kind of the more concrete ways that historically this has happened and also is happening right now. Because I think that these dialogues have to be happening, right? Black people, whether they're Christian or Muslim, are living in the same communities with each other. Typically, they are having conversations with each other, right? They're engaging in conversations about whether it's police brutality, right? Or schools, or right, the voting system, or whatever it is, right, that concern them. And these things can be couched in terms of not only race, but also religion as well. One of the things that I did find when I was kind of trying to do some preliminary, right, internet research on the topic is a lot of what comes up when you talk about interreligious dialogue, like Muslim Christian interreligion or interreligious interaction, is the fact that apparently Muslim Christian interreligious marriages in the United States, at least, are growing. And I've always thought about like love and interpersonal relationships actually is a really interesting way of that intercommunal dialogue is built, right? Because automatically, right, like you have two families, two communities, right, that have this dialogue with each other by virtue of the fact that they both love somebody that loves somebody else.
Mhm.
And so I think that these conversations have to be happening, right, in these communities. I think it's a matter of us figuring out, right, like how they're taking place. As an academic question, but I would love it if somebody in the audience had something to offer as well. So,
Mhm. Well, thank you both for your insights on this question. And I've just been very struck by the comment that you made, Elena, around love, and the fact that love can break down barriers, you know, and that can be transformative. And just thinking how, if we look at some of the tenets of the Christian religion, which speaks about the greatest commandment is love, and love of self and love of neighbor. And that if we truly live that out, how dialogue could really take place. You know, that's just something that has really struck me. I am mindful of our time, and so I'd like to really invite Saeed to join me and to open up this conversation to our community also. And so this will be a time that we will move into question and answer and also further dialogue. So we won't even need right now we won't even need the PowerPoint. Maybe we can just open it up to seeing all of our wonderful faces.
Mm-hmm.
And
thank you, Vanessa. I mean, I think to Dr. Morgan's last point about interreligious marriages, that's really an important point, which is that, you know, interreligious dialogue isn't just at some institutional level, right? It happens in everyday lives. And you know, I know there are countless African-American families within among who have Muslim and Christian members. And so you do have interreligious dialogue happening at a personal level and in terms of dialogue of life. So it is very much happening. I did not know that there's a rise in interreligious marriages between African-American Christians and Muslims, and that's really fascinating insight. And I wonder what that is, what is contributing to that. So questions have been pouring in, and one question that has been asked is, what type of link existed between Christian and Muslim communities that came to the U.S. or came to the Americas, and how they were, what type of connections they felt that they still had to their homeland. So I'll invite Dr. Moore to speak first.
Well, again, I don't know a whole lot about that, but the connections between the African Christians and the African Muslims when they first came. But it seems that the Sea Islands of Georgia just keep coming up over and over again. That there were that the Sea Islands are a place where there was a stronger retention of Islam, and it's also a place where you've got Christians, and there are some things that I think we have generally understood to be, oh, this is something from traditional African religion that becomes a part of the Christian practices of African American Christians. And it's not to say that it's absolutely not, but one example is the ring shout. And that a lot of people now are looking again, because we're like seeing more clearly now how important Muslims were in the earliest period of America. That perhaps that ring shout, which is a counterclockwise spiritual dance, maybe that comes from Islam, or maybe it's a retention of Islam with the circumambulation of the Kaaba and the spiritual dances of Islam, possibly. I don't know if that's it, if that kind of gets at the question a little bit.
I think so.
Ada, did you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this last question about the last part of the question about the connections that people felt to their homelands, I think is really important, right? Because at some point, right, when people first are brought or forcibly brought to the Americas, they are Africans, right? They are not African Americans. And so the connections that they feel are with their own ethnic communities, right? And with their homelands. At some point, right, there's like a creolization process that happens. People become African American, right? They don't have that connection with Africa anymore. That's kind of ruptured. There's like a new identity, right, that forms. But I think that the thing is that like Christian and Muslim people are very familiar with each other, right? Enslaved Christian and Muslim, but they live in West Africa or in West Central Africa. Even if they're living in a Muslim polity, there are Christian people that are living amongst them, right? If they're living in a majority Christian area, right, there are Muslim people, right, that are living amongst them, right? Like, so people are very familiar with each other's religious religions, right? Like they're very familiar with each other, right? And I think that there's a point at which like a very long process, right, of going from being African to being African American, right? And that at the beginning, right, people feel much of a connection to their homelands. And as time goes on, right, that connection is much more attenuated because they don't have, right, like a direct link anymore. Yeah, if that answers your question.
Thank you. We have another question in our chat. How can we as Christians who are not African Americans contribute to this dialogue of faith, especially with our Christian brothers and sisters? I guess this is pointed towards you, Cecilia. And then, Elena, if you have any suggestions also.
This conversation about the rise of Islam and the rise of Islam and the rise of Christianity, I think anybody can contribute to this conversation who has an interest in learning and in learning. So I think that there's always a place for people who want to learn. In terms of building a sense of community, I think that, like we said, we were hard pressed to find examples of this interreligious dialogue, specifically between Black Christians and Black Muslims. And so I would say that's probably an area where, okay, we need to start with Black Christians and Black Muslims, getting together, getting to know each other, getting to appreciate each other's histories, and talking about the things that we share in common and what we can do, what we can achieve for each other. Because if we can do something that positive for our communities, it's the benefit redounds to everybody. The benefit redounds to everybody. But I do think probably in the beginning, it would be most important for Black Muslims and Black Christians to forge an enduring conversation and connection with each other. And then other Muslims and Christians certainly who have a desire to be a part of what these two communities decide to do, they can find their place in that work too. That's what I'd say. That's what I'd say.
Elena, do you have any insights that you would like to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that this is a question of like how you can be an ally, right? For Black Christian people, right? If you're not if you're right, a white Christian or just a non-Black Christian person, right? You're asking, like, how can you support your Black Christian co-religionists, right? And I would say that this probably applies, right, to Islam as well, or any religion.
Yes.
I think in allyship in general, right, like the most important thing is to start conversations with people and to listen to people and to ask them what it is that they would like for you to do, right? To ask them what it is that what can be helpful for you to do and for you to contribute with the resources that you have, right? So that's like what I would say. I mean, like, I think that it's really a matter of listening, right? Because it sounds from the question like this person really wants to, like, they really want to do something, right? Like they really want to contribute to kind of like that understanding and to kind of stem the sense of marginalization that African American people feel, right, in the Christian tradition, and that applies, right, to other religious traditions as well. But I think that sometimes the problem with allies, sometimes, right, is that they'll take the conversation over, and you just want to make sure you're not taking the conversation over, that you're trying to involve yourself, right, in the conversation in a way that is actually helpful for each of the people that you're trying to support. So that's just what that's all that I have to offer.
Thank you. Thank you. Saeed.
Yes, thank you. So we just have a couple more minutes, and we had a bunch of questions rolling in, and so but what I'd like to present or ask both of you is that as you were preparing for tonight, in terms of your reflections and this amazing insights that you've provided, what was perhaps one of the most surprising things that you found in the research, or in something that's related to the some of the discussion topics that we touched on today? And Dr. Morgan, you can go first.
Yeah, I think that the thing that was most, a lot of the research that I did, I think that I knew most of this stuff already. Like I've been teaching about this for a while, so that didn't really surprise me. But I know that the last question, when we first had talked about this, both Cecilia and I were like, oh, we're gonna have to do some research on this. We don't know, right? And I kind of expected, honestly, to at least find some concrete examples, right? You can find anything on the internet these days. So when you type in Muslim Christian interreligious dialogue, you would expect something to come up, right? That leads you down some sort of path, right? And I think that the thing that surprised me the most was that it was so difficult, right, to find any sort of institutional example, right, of Black Christian Muslim interreligious dialogue. And so that indicates to me that is an area that really needs to be, that's something that people need to do, right? Because Black people have things to say to each other, and I think that religion is absolutely, right, a way that they can forge, right, these connections with each other. I mean, even just these anecdotal examples of Standing Rock, right, environmental justice, of Black Lives Matter, right, these are all things that I'm confident that there are examples, but I just was so surprised that I just couldn't find anything, honestly.
Thank you. Dr. Moore?
Yes, like Elena, I teach much of this, what I spoke about tonight. I teach it on a fairly regular basis. So there weren't really big surprises for me. I guess what for me, working, preparing for this and thinking about the questions that you had asked us, it just shows me how much more I need to learn. That there's so much that I do not know, that I should know, and that I want to know. So it's been a humbling experience for me. I do think coming. So I couldn't find these interreligious dialogue examples, really good examples. But when I sat down and I thought about, well, what could we talk about when and if we ever get together, I could come up with a lot of things. And the thing that for me, I would want to do the most, there are two things that I want to do the most. One is to have that historical conversation. I'd love to sit down and talk about, what do you think about this? Do you think that is the ring shout in, is this a carryover of Islam? Is this what this is? Or I'd love to talk about things like that with Black Muslims. But I also really, it's pressing for me the question of immigration right now, because we do have, we're in terms of the Black Catholic community, the native born, I'll call them the native born African Americans, we're older. It's an older demographic. A lot of the young people did not stay, and many do not seem like they're getting ready to come back. But I know in my own parish here in Dayton, Ohio, we do have young people, and they are from Africa, various countries in Africa, and they have children. And so the big question is, how do we make them feel welcome, and how do we learn about each other so that we can create a new community? And I'd love to have a conversation with a Black Muslim community about this, because I wonder if their situation is the same. Is the demographic of Black Muslims in America an older demographic? And are they being revived now by the immigrant communities who are Muslim who are coming in?
Thank you. That's a really an excellent question, and one to definitely think through. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Vanessa. Vanessa, you're on mute, just in case.
I see that. I got that. Thank you so much. This has been an enriching conversation. I know that I have learned so much in these few short moments we've had together. We'd like to thank Dr. Elena Morgan and Dr. Cecilia Moore for being with us this evening and sharing your wisdom and your research. As we journey forward, let us continue to work together to build bridges, to transform structures, and to be open to learning from one another. There is a richness in both our traditions that can truly transform our world if we are open. As we reflect on this day, I'd like to invite you to please join us on March 7th, 2023, next year, as we continue the conversation and look toward our present context with Dr. Tia Noel Pratt from Villanova University and Dr. Amina Beverly McLeod-Eldine from DePaul University, who will focus their attention on Christianity and Islam in the present day African American context. Again, I thank you. I thank you for being with us here tonight, and may you journey forth in peace and love. Thank you.